After some weeks that we've been on topics that not directly related to IAM, we talk about developer productivity, we talk about many stuff that in general development. Today we are going back to the core of identity access management with a topic that I really like. I actually get myself deeply to this conflict in the last Identiverse conference when I just stroll around and a company that do authorization for deeply IT workforce salesperson told me, "Hey, I'm not speaking to you. You are from Permit. We are a competitor." And I say, "No, we are not competitor. We can just help each other." And then I say, "Okay, something has changed. Workforce and customer identity. We should unify them. We should still separate them." And since then, I have the dream to do this live stream. So today we are going to talk about customer versus workforce identity. But before we start and introduce our guest, a couple of announcements. So first, we are recording this live stream. So if you need to drop off, just drop off. You'll get an email after. It will not go to spam with the link to YouTube with the live stream recorded. And you also invited to ask some question or share your thoughts wherever you are watching us. Could be YouTube, LinkedIn, Twitter, whatever platform. We see all the comments. So just comment and we'll see that there. We are trying to answer question live, but we not always have the time. And if you want to get time dedicated to you in the last 5 to 10 minutes, we are allowing time for questions. So just throw your question or wait to the end of the hour if you have any question for us, for Reed, for Martin, for Or. And I really want to thank again to Permit that sponsor me to do this live stream every week. And with that said, let's start. So first, I want to thanks again for our guests today. I think they are great for the topic that we are going to discuss. We have with me Reed, co-founder and CEO of Stitch, a very hot CIM authentication, auth, identity, fraud analysis startup, and Martin, a product leader of identity access management in IKEA. Do you want to introduce yourself? Let's start with you, Reed.
Yeah, definitely. I'm calling in from San Francisco. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Stitch, as you mentioned, but maybe we'll just provide a little bit of context. Prior to Stitch, I worked at a large fintech company called Plaid, which is at least very large in the United States. I think has a more limited footprint in Europe, but effectively Plaid is the primary way that end users connect their bank accounts to financial applications like Venmo, Robinhood, Coinbase, etc. And I worked on customer identity there, both the B2C side of, if Reed, I myself wanted to add my bank account and connect to Venmo, what is that authentication authorization process like? But then also on the B2B side of Plaid had our own developer customers that needed to log into the Plaid dashboard to manage API keys, things like that. And about 4.5 years ago, my co-founder, who was a backend engineer on the identity team, where I was a product manager, and I started Stitch, primarily because of a lot of the frustrations we ran into with legacy SIAM solutions. But I think one of the things we were just talking about before we kicked off the live stream with Martin is that you have customer identity, you have workforce identity, and as customer identity has both B2C and B2B, this B2B kind of sits somewhere in the middle in terms of it has requirements from the workforce identity personas, right? Like the IT admins usually make those policies. And I'm sure we'll get much more into that detail later. But yeah, we're based in San Francisco and about 4.5-year-old startup.
Yeah, so that's impressive intro. And with that, let's go to Martin. Tell us a little about yourself.
So my name is Martin Sandren, and I've been in the IAM space for about almost 25 years now, 20 plus years at least. Originally from Sweden, lived in Germany, UK, the US, and the Netherlands since 2013. In my day job, I am the product lead for IKEA for identity and access. So IKEA is the mother company in the IKEA group. And in my spare time, I enjoy doing things like this. And also I'm part of the ID Pro and one of the founders of chapters of Identity Beer. And also like to speak at conferences.
Very cool.
Yeah, and I must say that since I got this honorable guest for the discussion, I felt that I can't lead it alone. So I asked Orvais, my manager and CEO co-founder of Permit.io, to join me and lead this discussion. So thanks for joining us, Or. I want to start with a question to Reed, because we are going to talk about today on the topic of customer versus workforce identity. And I know that you're leading Stitch, and Stitch, if you ever logged into Stitch or start playing with that, then you are get distinction between B2B identity and B2C identity. Is that a modern name for customer and workforce? What is that distinction?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the way I would describe it is customer identity management has probably been too synonymous with just consumer identity in the past. Whereas one of the issues that we actually had at Plaid when we were working on both the consumer side of an end user logging into an application, then also the side of, the developer at a company trying to log into the plaid.com dashboard, is actually the needs and requirements are quite different in the B2C authentication use case versus that B2B one where we're authenticating a developer logging into the dashboard to manage those API keys, add members, invite members, et cetera. Usually we had different requirements, such as a lot of our customers would require enterprise single sign-on, so log in with Okta, log in with Azure, et cetera. They'd have different provisioning requirements where they'd want to be able to lock down who actually could get access. And then they'd want things like directory sync, so that say that a developer left an organization or changed roles, how could we automatically sync the information from the identity provider at that workforce and decide, okay, this person should not still have access to the API keys, given those are kind of the keys to the kingdom. And so when we started Stitch, one of the issues we had run into is that a lot of the kind of legacy customer identity solutions, like Auth0 being the big one that's now been acquired by Okta, they do support both use cases, but they fit them under the same data model where you have consumers and users, and then you can add authentication methods to them, and you can start to group them. So you can stick them in an organization and then say, for this organization, I want them to use enterprise single sign-on. The big problem that we had is actually the reason we wanted to bifurcate that definition of B2C versus B2B and make that really clear in our product is the entity that owns that account is drastically different, right? In the actual B2C true consumer end user use case, the end user owns their own account. In the B2B use case, even though it's still customer identity in our parlance, because it is a customer of an application, like it's the Plaid developer, that is still a customer of Plaid. They're not an employee of Plaid logging in. They don't actually own their own account. It's the actual organization that owns the account. And so therefore, the way that we model those products is very different. Like it's a user first data model in B2C. In B2B, it's the organization is the top level entity. And then you have cascading rules and configurations that you can set on that organization, such as this organization has just-in-time provisioning. This one has directory sync. This one needs explicit invites. This other one requires enterprise single sign-on. This one might not have enterprise single sign-on, but it requires sign-in with email magic link and MFA through passkey or something like that. And so for us, it was primarily around how do you distinguish between who owns the actual end account, and so therefore who should be the actual decision maker on how the authentication happens. So in that consumer use case, I as Reed can just decide if I want 2FA, if I don't want 2FA. In the B2B context, obviously there's an actual IT policy that's driving how you want authentication to be driven.
Yeah, I remember the day when I moved from Cisco to Palo Alto Network, and all the setup was shifted in one day, like 10 years forward. In Cisco, we have this, Outlook emails and identity that is on-prem, and it actually sits on physical Active Directory. And then I moved to Palo Alto Networks, and then my identity was like nothing, was something in the cloud. If I just try to log into our GitHub organization, then it told me you need to go to the VPN because Okta had some protection there. And when I'm thinking about the way that you describe it now, that customer can have the organization model of ownership, like the traditional workforce on ownership, I'll be happy to hear from Martin. Do you think that we are going into an era where workforce and customer identity will manage together, because we'll move into kind of model that a modern SaaS just has users that maybe manage from this perspective, maybe manage from the other, but all managed on the same IAM effort?
Well, if you look historically, there were some cases where you tried to use internal IAM, workforce IAM, as for sale. if you look, there were some stacks, like the IBM stack, for example, was very good at ISIM and ISAM, could really be used for both. There were some other stacks that tries to use them for CAM, but where the data models just didn't scale. So they completely fell over once you hit like 100,000 usage, which you hit quite quickly when we're talking about a CAM solution. You also actually had some cases where there was more B2B focused products that didn't really scale well above 100,000 or so users. But of course, the B2B products usually had very good delegation features and the ability to build out the structures that Reed mentioned. It's a very good question, because if you look at right now, you have a consolidation wave. So you see the consolidation primarily between the IGA products and the PAM products, and in some cases also the access products. In some iteration of those three different nodes. You can see that is kind of one of the strongest kind of trends in the marketplace at the moment. But the CM side has kind of been sitting on the sidelines. So I don't think, if you look, of course, like Okta that bought Auth0, but I don't really think you can say that those two products have become very kind of joined at the hip by any means.
Yeah.
So I am not sure from a customer perspective, why would you like to make sure that the idea with the best of suite is that you can have easy integrations, but do you really see that strong integration between your IGA system and your CAM system, for example?
Yeah, I think I can add something from the permit perspective. So obviously we focus a lot on permissions on the authorization side. Once you've went through identity provisioning, once you went through authentication, and now you're at the identities trying to perform actions against different things, we start to see that there's a gray area, a recursive gray area where these start to overlap. And this is I think most apparent when you look on authorization for authorization. So now you're a developer, you're building software, internal or external facing, and now you need to decide on some of your identities what permissions, what type of access they will have to change the access of other users. And you go in one single hop by talking on those permissions, you go from managing your workforce, because usually that identity that will be managing permissions would be a workforce identity, to having access or affecting end customer access and permissions, because that's usually the end users that you'll find in customer facing applications. So as we see more permissions getting more complex in more applications, and we're seeing more and more engineers working on that, just from that recursive aspect of authorization, I think we're starting to see that explode. And also maybe to connect to something that Martin mentioned, and with privileged access management. So that's like an entire category. How am I as an organization? How do I make sure that all the people working have the right access to the right things and the different services that I'm consuming? And something that we're starting to see there, again, coming from the authorization perspective, is that a lot of the patterns that you used to see just for the workforce are starting to be used also against the consumer. So for example, time-based access. That used to be very, very commonplace. So now I'm onboarding an employee or I'm offboarding them. I want their access to be invalidated or validated within a point in time. Now we're seeing these patterns being incorporated into SaaS applications for the end consumer. And I think that's maybe just a byproduct of maybe software eating the world and having more software around there. So I feel like there is a trajectory where we'll see these overlap more and more, but I'm curious to hear what you folks think.
Yeah, maybe one thing I'd add, and I think Martin mentioned that, Okta's acquisition of Auth0 is actually a good example of trying to unify customer identity and workforce identity. Obviously, Okta's historically been known as a really big workforce identity player. Auth0 is a very large customer identity player. And Martin had I think the comment that they're still not joined at the hip. And I think there's an interesting question of, is that an actual like product and technological problem, or is that a organizational problem in terms of how people make decisions around customer versus workforce identity? And I think, someone from Okta and Auth0 would probably have a much more interesting like retrospective on what has worked and what hasn't worked in that integration. But one thing that we've noticed is just the persona that buys customer identity versus workforce identity tends to be quite different. Customer identity decisions are typically driven by the engineering team and developers of what they need in order to satisfy certain product requirements, certain technical requirements around how an end user should be able to log into their application, versus workforce identity has historically been the IT admin who's actually trying to think about the security perimeter of their own employees and workforce. And so that's one of the things that has less to do with how convergent the technology and product decisions are, but more so just that I think it's pretty interesting how, even though they have very similar seeming objectives, they are different enough in both like how they approach buying software that I, at least on the go-to-market side, have not seen customer and workforce identity converge probably as much as like an Okta would have predicted 3 years ago when they acquired Auth0. Not to say it won't happen more quickly over the next few years, though.
So that is, of course, a very interesting observation. What we do see on the workforce side is that more and more IGA stacks, so the workforce IAM stacks and access, they move in under the CISOs rather than the workforce productivity teams. And of course, CISOs are also very concerned about the customer data and who has access to what customer data under what circumstances. So there could be an interesting convergence there being launched by the fact that the buying power, the buying personality for the CM stacks starts perhaps moving into the CISOs.
Mm-hmm. So do you feel like shift left pattern, is that going to be driving this forward from the foreseeable future?
So I think what we have been seeing is that the general problem is that it used to be that IAM team's only interaction with the developers was that you control a few groups and you provision and deprovision identities, perhaps a few groups, perhaps a bit of attributes. And as you, especially if you're, for example, a Microsoft-centric company, an Entra-centric company, you will have a much more complex world, because in Entra, applications could have much more complex access with Entra roles, etc. And that means that you're much closer to developers. So what tends to happen sometimes is that the AM team is happily sitting and doing their stuff, and then there's a design done for the application, or that requires sometimes very extensive privileges inside of the Entra instance. And that can sometimes then be pushed out the decision to saying that the only IAM team does is they take the ticket and they execute the ticket. And that then creates quite large friction points when IAM team gets the ticket and they say, well, this is outside of our normally granted access. So why do you need these very extensive roles? And the only way to really kind of address that conflict, because at that point it's usually very late in the process. So when IAM says no to executing the ticket, you basically have a missed go-live date for the project. So the only thing that can kind of resolve that conflict is if you bring in the identity part earlier and see how can you make a least privilege or vaguely reasonable privileges design and try to contain the amount of access that's been granted.
Yeah. I think. Yeah, go ahead. I think the shift left question is interesting because of the roles that actually related to IAM. Traditionally, IAM was led by IT department, and as you said, like the workforce productivity or whatever the name is. But with the shift left and many even traditional companies, I know, Martin, that you asked not speaking the name of the company that you work for, so you not even mentioned the name. But even like traditional company, became, in large portion of them, a software company, even a cloud software company. And I think that could also, drive this forward, because if IT person that traditionally, like 10, 15 years ago, been a person who knows computer very well, knows setup very well, very responsible for their setup, today they are developers, even if they do like completely IT stuff. And I think that also could drive this. But the more question is about how do we bridge these architectures? Because as you mentioned, and especially for companies that has traditional IT infrastructure, and they have a very modern customer infrastructure, and the CISO want, to get control on, let's say, for example, I don't know, MFA permission, some security flow. How do you build this bridge between traditional IT and cloud native or full cloud services in the company?
Yeah. Maybe before you answer, I want to add one more thing here. I think something that is very apparent is that this problem is being dropped on the developers, on the engineers. Like I can count on one hand the amount of days a week that developers don't come in and asking, how do I get the identity information so I can use it in my software? It's so you see it both on the workforce side and on the consumer side. On the consumer side, by the way, it's even more challenging. They say, how do I connect to the identity management? How do I work with this single sign-on of my end customer? So you have this chain of both procuring the identity information into the software that you're building as a developer, and the developers are de facto forced to solve this problem. And secondly, they are also forced to solve translation problems that a lot of times are just kind of ignored. Like a lot of times people assume, oh, the identity that you have in your identity management and the roles that you have there are the equivalent to what you have in your software, aka saying a role like VP of marketing is equivalent to the role of editor in your application. And a lot of times it's left as kind of a footnote, and developers are the ones that have to pick up the bill. So I wonder, what do you think about that? Both the fact that this problem exists and the fact that it's on developers' table.
Reed, do you want to take that first?
Yeah. I was just thinking about, there's kind of like two different sides of the developer actually that we're talking about. If we're starting to talk about workforce and customer, where say that let's talk about shift left a little bit, like a CISO thinking about the risks with both workforce and customer identity. Obviously, there are elements that impact the developer at your own company in terms of the workforce side of how do we actually manage these systems. Obviously, IT is probably the biggest element there, but I think, or what you're saying is there are also developer dependencies even in that workforce use case outside of IT. I was just thinking about there's that developer angle, and then there's also the angle of if I'm a CISO that let's just presume I'm the CISO of Stitch, and I want to presume not only is our workforce authentication identity locked down, but I also have to think about the side of the flip side of our customer identity. And what I mean by that is we are the customer in a lot of really sensitive applications that we access that are outside of my perimeter. And so in that context, it's like when I have employees that log into Stripe or log into AWS or log into any other crucial service that has sensitive data and sensitive actions that they can take. And what's interesting is like, if I am doing my job, I think as a CISO in making sure I'm managing the risk around our company, often actually the requirements I'm going to have in terms of both workforce and then our end dependency on those other third-party applications is actually going to hit the developer at another company, where what I'm going to say for Stripe or for GitHub or AWS, I need XYZ provisioning control. I need XYZ password strength requirement. Like it's all the permutations that you see in the B2B customer identity space. And so that's what I think is interesting, but also challenging maybe for CISOs as they think about owning both of these, is that they can set policy, but they are dependent on the actual like capabilities, at least in the customer identity sense, being supplied and then enabled by a developer at another company. And so that's where it starts to get, I think, a little bit wonkier versus maybe what a traditional CISO's control and command structure might look like in terms of what resources are fully owned. And so I think as a result, when I think about B2B customer identity, complying with the requirements that a security team puts forward, a lot of those right now, I would say it would really be improved if there was better vetting on their side. Like right now we have contracts where like I need SSO to sign this contract. I have not seen a lot of CISOs take it upon themselves to make sure they have great audit capabilities of if every third-party tool we're using is actually properly using enterprise SSO and directory sync in the ways we want. I'm not saying I haven't seen some do that really well, but I don't think it's a tried and true like element that everyone practices what they preach.
Yeah.
I think in general, if you look at from a kind of enterprise IAM, I've been last couple of roles have been the either engineering manager or product owner at pretty large companies. So it's totally fine to say the company name. It's just IKEA. It's just that we don't like that where our logo shows up in other places, so that can be very sensitive. But if you look at it, developers tends to be some of the people that are hardest to satisfy because they really understand what you do mostly. So you can't really just go to there are no droids here. And depending on how good they are, another big challenge you often have is that a lot of development is system integration today. It's very uncommon that you write things from scratch, and that means that you come with an instruction often from your supplier saying, okay, I need this and this and this and that. And those instructions are usually written not really least privileged, they're usually written most privileged because that makes it more likely that the developer are successful. When it comes how to support the developer communities, it's actually not an easy question. I think this is one of the hardest part to get right as an enterprise product owner. What you usually tend to do is to buy or build platforms and then platforms upon platforms. But these platforms often need extended privileges, which then means that suddenly you have lost the control of your core systems. If you have one platform, it isn't really a problem. But if you go to an enterprise, you might have, one Oracle platform, one SAP platform, some Java platforms, some other platforms. And suddenly you have, 10, 20, 100 accounts that has the right to, unless you manage to building blast zones, they have the rights to do, for example, group management on all group members. So you do need to take a look at those kind of things as well, and how to enable the different development teams. If you look at someone that did that very successfully was Stira, because most developers aren't really that interested in access management. They want to develop code. They have a business problem to solve or a technical problem that they want to solve. So what Stira offered with OPA was a way to control access to your applications in a efficient way, because it was open source. The developer could just go out and get it. And then once they did that and another 6 to 18 months passed, suddenly they had hundreds of these OPAs. And then Stira could come in and say, hey, don't you want to get a little bit better control of this, especially if it's the CISO that starts seeing problems. So, of course, that is a very interesting business approach for tools in this space.
Yeah. Do you think we need more standards here? So we keep talking about how we enable people to manage this and connect between the different services. So my application or my organization and the services that I'm consuming, like Stripe, for example, was mentioned. So do you think if we had better standards, this would be easier? And also, do we need different standards for workforce and for consumer?
It's a good question. What I was trying to think through in my mind is, I don't know if the answer is we need, well, I'll say this first, which is, yeah, I was thinking of the comic, which you might recall, where it's like, we need a better standard than X. There's too many standards. We need one to unite them all. And then you end up with like a 14th standard, and that one doesn't get adoption and doesn't take off. And I think it's a little bit different in this case, but because I think what you're right, that there are some pretty gnarly standards out there like SAML and SCIM, especially when it comes to like B2B customer identity. And obviously OAuth and OIDC have their own advantages. But one of the things I was just thinking about is, we support enterprise SSO. And I want to say, if I looked up the numbers right now, probably still 80% of the SSO connections that we provide to customers are SAML, not OIDC, even though obviously OIDC is the more modern option. And I think part of that, part of my answer that leads to is, I think this is less of we need a better standard that will solve this. And instead, this has to be more around standard and compliance hygiene around like what we want to push for. Like I always think about something we've never gotten in the customer identity space that the payment space got was PCI compliance, as something that said, you cannot just touch a raw credit card and store this. And so one of the things we never got in customer identity was passwords being treated like that. And I think there are pros or cons to being overly regulated like that. But one of the things people should think about is passwords effectively became similar to credit cards, where credit cards, it was much more obvious that this number could be used anywhere for payments. The way users actually use passwords, though, is the same problem as credit cards, where most users reuse the same password across dozens of different sites. So you end up with this daisy chain risk where if one of them gets breached, that's why their bank account gets breached or their PayPal gets breached. Mm-hmm. And so I guess this comes back to like, I probably am less bullish on a new standard will solve it, and more bullish on more inventive ways of creating the right incentives for IT, CISO suites, et cetera, to make sure they're pushing for the right available standard. Because I think, even every B2B app doesn't support SSO and SCIM, which if they did, even though they're imperfect standards, would solve a lot of the breach vectors that we see today.
Yeah. I kind of agree with what you say on definitely on the authentication side. I will say that I do feel that there's a need on the authorization side. So for example, Martin mentioned an organization's developers are able to write policy as code, but for example, with OPA, and implement how they want the policy to work across their org. But there isn't a way for me as a CISO or as the consumer of them to say, this is how I expect your policy to enforce my compliance or my higher level policies when using your product. And I feel like that there might be still a gap there, but I definitely agree with your statement there.
Yeah, and definitely I'll defer to Permit on the auth expertise. We have some basic RBAC functionality, but I know Permit is where we recommend customers go for much more advanced ABAC, reback, things like that. So it makes sense that there's maybe some bigger issues there to be solved in the authorization space.
So I think we run into a very specific problem at the moment, but let's continue. Hopefully the internet will not go down as well. So I do completely agree. I've been in this space for almost 25 years now, and I remember the first federation implementation I did. There was no SAML back in 2001, and then we basically had to code everything. I got my crypto book from university out, and we come up with a custom protocol, and it worked. It was an ERP integration between one system that built fighter jet engines and another system that maintained the fighter jet engines. So we need to move the user back and forth to see where the fighter jet engine parts were in the world. But that took probably 100, perhaps even 150 if you count everything, workdays. And today, any of my engineers do a SAML integration in less than an hour, certainly, if you count all the enterprise overhead, and the technical part is probably like 20 minutes. You can even automate it fully for people that are a little bit more mature, so that you just call an API and you get a federation integration. So that is a huge improvement. And sure, SCIM is not a perfect protocol, but it's a lot better than SPML. But it's interesting that SAML keeps on being there, because it is really not a very nice standard. Like it's far too big, simply put. And with all the canalization and so on, it's almost impossible to get it completely secure. So, but the fact is, like I'm seeing same thing. I probably have about 80% SAML integrations in my integrations, and we still make them all the time. And the question is, if the application just supports SAMLs, that is a lot better to do SSO against my user base than not do SSO at all, because I would prefer that they use the YDC instead.
Yep. No, definitely. I think fully agreed with you there, where I think probably what we're both saying, or I don't want to put words in your mouth, but at least what I was, if I had to sum up my perspective on it, I think adoption is still the biggest hurdle rather than protocol standardization. But you are right. There's certain things like SAML that, even though they're so popular, continue to be really imperfect standards. Like the level of hoops that we had to jump through to create a SAML service as a service, right, for our customers from a security side was, you just see all of these foot guns in SAML as a protocol, where you need to take extremely evasive measures to make sure that you are particularly hardened against some of the security potential vulnerabilities. And so to your point, if we could go back 20 years, I'd definitely prefer that we standardized around something better than SAML, but I still think adoption is the bigger concern. I also, for folks on the live stream who may or may not know, but Or and Gabriel are in Tel Aviv. And obviously there's a lot of, turmoil happening right now. And so that's why they had to hop out to get to shelter. So our thoughts are with them, but just wanted to give that context.
So we can get the question from Breda. So we have a question from Norway coming in here. How topic of data translate through the value chain across the planes is very relevant. This is an interesting problem as well. I was at a conference last week that was more geared towards Microsoft software, and we talked a little bit about different ways to manage data lakes, which is an area where I'm not very knowledgeable. And they talked about the bronze, silver, and gold approach. So you suck in your data into your bronze lake, and then you refine it, and then you send it up to silver, and then finally to gold, where you have your end users consuming it. And for identity data, this is of course a very interesting concept, because usually you have very different level of quality on your identity data. For example, you might have quite a lot into a quite good quality, usually for your coworkers or employees, while for contractors the data might vary a lot, and you might not have all the data, and you might derive a lot of data out of the sponsors of the contractors rather than actually from where the contractor is. So this is also a really interesting concept here, and well worth reading up on. What's your take on it, Reed?
That's actually fascinating. I had not heard of that concept of kind of like the bronze, silver, gold data lakes. And so I am less familiar with that, but it makes a lot of sense to me just the way that you described it. And is definitely, I appreciate the reference to the article, Brede, because that will be something I'll be checking out after this call.
So Reed, what do you see as what are the things you're most excited about at the moment in your world?
Yeah, it's interesting. The thing I'm probably most excited about is also the thing that we're probably also most worried about as kind of changing trend when it comes to customer identity. But I don't know, maybe that means it's the perfect intersection of exciting and worrisome, which is the way, like one of the things that we're thinking a lot about is as AI is becoming more agentic, how does that change how you start to think about authorization and authentication? Where, for example, there are some rudimentary implementations of this now, where the concept of customer identity has to change a little bit to, it's not just Reed logging into this application, but Reed is permissioning this agent to go do something on their behalf. And so it's something we're both very interested in and like excited about, because one of our issues with identity as it relates to the internet has always been, we believe it's way too frictionful. Both there's a lot of actual friction and hoops the user has to jump through, but they're not always secure by default. I think like, the fact that we make users create 120 different passwords to navigate the web is an example of that, where it's both high friction, but not highly secure, because end users will find shortcuts for themselves and they'll reuse the same password everywhere just to try to give themselves more convenience. But one of the things that we're starting to see is as AI use cases are becoming more productive. And I think we're still a model or two generation away from this. So maybe this is next like 3-4 years. We would expect that most consumer apps, most identity apps have to start modeling the idea of John Doe and John Doe's AI agent, which might have different roles, permissions, or MFA requirements of how it is able to take action on their behalf, either read or write. And so that's both very exciting to us, but it also relates to another concern that's very worrisome to us, which is it's never been harder to tell whether something is a bot or a human online right now. And that's only going to get significantly harder over the next few years. Especially like if I don't know if you saw the Ars Technica article that came out yesterday of just how good at CAPTCHA solutions some of the AI vision has become. And we've always had CAPTCHA problems, right? There's full CAPTCHA farms in many developing countries that allow them to effectively take the public key from a Google CAPTCHA, send it off to Venezuela or Russia, solve it, send it back. That's always been a problem. But now we're both getting that and the fact that AI is able to, for a fairly few tokens, actually solve a lot of the challenges that we give them and is going to become increasingly better at it. And so for us, I think we're both very excited about where agents and AI come in as a way to bolster the customer identity experience, but also where it becomes much more fraught of how do I tell whether this is actually Reed. And so that's actually probably been the single biggest kind of evolution we've gone through over the last 2.5 years, is that we've gone very deep in the fraud prevention and risk side, particularly on kind of being a truth-telling machine of whether this is a human or a bot, whether it's someone coming from, whether it's headless browsing, whether it's Node, whether it's Python, et cetera. And the reason we find that quite important is that we think in the 2020s, as AI and kind of these machine use cases become more prevalent, your SIAM solution won't just be a front door to your application. You'll also want it to be a security system and like a bouncer effectively, which is not to say that SIAMs don't do any of that today, but I think it's pretty surface level. So that's probably what we're most excited about, is just how agentic AI starts to change both for the better, but then also introduce some new risks around how do you tell who this is on the other side. But yeah, I'd love to flip the question back to you. Maybe it's more in the workforce side, but curious what you're most interested in now or excited about.
I think it's a really interesting area. Some of my friends who work more in the SAML side, especially on the financials, they spend a huge amount of the resources on anti-fraud. You do see also that this concept of the consigliere, or that every person has their AI bot to do their work. In Estonia, they've actually created what's called a krati, which is a little Estonian folklore creature that kind of is like a little helper that lives in your house and that you have to be nice to, otherwise they will do evil things with you. But if you're nice to them, then they help you on the farm. And this is then used to be able to can delegate your permissions. So, for example, if you would need a construction permit for expanding your house, you can have the krati go and get all the paperwork and ready, and then you just sign it, and then it does it for you. But then comes, of course, the interesting question: how do I delegate in a safe way to this krati so it doesn't do things like move me to Tahiti or something, which probably could do. The other interesting aspect on this is that I saw a very interesting webinar from the CEO of Klarna. It's a Nordic fintech company that has basically managed to use AI very extensively to resolve a lot of the quite complex flows. For example, where you have a transaction that is contested, and try to figure out who is right. Is the merchant, or is it the consumer or the buyer? And one of the things that he was really concerned about, and the regulation that he wanted, was better digital IDs, because you're getting to the point where it's almost impossible to figure out, like you said, who is a bot and who is a human. And without cryptographic very strong ability to determine that of course will not really solve the problem. We just kind of move the problem down the road. Then the question is, how do you do the delegation in a safe manner to your AI? Because everyone is going to want no one is going to want to spend an hour and a half. I was trying to get control of my bank account in the UK in the weekend because I'm a US citizen, so I had to submit my taxes. And I had to figure out exactly how much money I had on an account that I created when I lived in the UK 20 years ago, and I ever closed out. The amount of time that a modern person spends on this kind of administration and the ability to have some form of have one of your AI bots talk to an AI bots at the other side and handle what kind of permissions and what rights have I given it.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think I think that's one of the things where it will be interesting to see as AI agents are effectively requiring the merging of human identity management and machine identity management, where I think you're going to start to see is us pulling inspiration from both, where it might look like machine-to-machine authentication with scopes, the OAuth flows that are being involved, et cetera, but you're going to need to add something like human-in-the-loop MFA for those use cases that you're talking about. I think it was the Crowdy or whatever the Estonian term was, which is how do you make sure it doesn't go off the rails? And so if it's going to do something that's going to try to move money or do something irreversible, how do you do a push notification to an end user that actually has to be in the flow of that authorization? And I'd imagine the authorization questions will be quite interesting in that world. And Gabriel, I hope everything's going okay over there. Are you guys okay?
Actually, we just got sirens and we had to go to the shelter. Apparently, we do not have any coverage yet there. I thought that we have. There is another one. I don't know. We are fine for now, surviving. Thanks for leading that. Feel free, we can stop it now. We can do it again at a different time so that we have a lively discussion. I'll be happy to watch it later. Yeah.
I think we came out quite well with the discussion. So I actually did have the question about what I believe is the more interesting parts. And of course, a lot of what we do is basically plumbing in any big operation. So a lot of it is not very exciting. What I do see as quite interesting areas is one is the emergence of ITDR, especially in the ability to detect and respond to attacks. And the new standard that's coming up in that space. And there, of course, AI is coming in as well to be able to detect and then spread in the organization that, hey, something is going wrong. We have a compromised identity and we need to start kind of at this probing on the identity to see if it was actually compromised. So we'll happily force them to give an MFA, or we might even change their password. And today, those integrations are quite expensive because either you're in a best of suite, so you can do it internally within the platform, or you have to do quite expensive system integration. But there are some quite interesting standards that are being launched in this space. But there, of course, the basic part is the standards are completely useless without being able to get them out to a bigger audience. So we'll see if this is going to be a SPML standard, the CAPE, and they're going to be SPML, or if they're going to be a SAML standard.
The CAPE is actually interesting standard because a couple of weeks ago I created a banking demo for Permit. We have also a lot of fintech, like Reed mentioned. Customers. So I created, and I did it with Stitch, and I created something, I call it the feedback loop of authentication and authorization, which, I do some authorization, and maybe I want to put the one-time password or something like that as a factor there, right? So I need to notify my authentication to send MFA. And CAPE is great, but it does not give the right developer experience to work with that, right? Even that you have the clients and you have that, you do not get the support for the edge case, and that aim more for engineers that familiar with IAM, familiar with standards, etc. And I think that that's one of the biggest challenges in modern identity is how we already discussed about it, but the way that you actually bridge the IAM challenges to developers, right? That's the thing. For example, one of the always focusing permissions from the application perspective, from the user perspective, not from the policy engine perspective. So back to the standards, I think we need to start think of standards that instead of give the protocol experience or the plumbing experience, give the Oh wow, there are rockets just on top of my home. I go back to the shelter. Although there is no sirens, I just saw them and from the window. So I think we actually need to make sure that the protocols and the standards need to be more in DX. We are going back to shelter,
Yeah.
and
Stay
feel
safe,
free to
Gabriel.
drop
Stay
off.
safe.
Thank you. Bye.
So I think we had a final question from Breda we can take before we end. What impact do you think AI could have on ITDR and PAM? So obviously, the first part is the ITDR and PAM. And there, in my opinion, what PAM offers is ability to put in speed bumps between the attacker and the really interesting targets. So today, it is extremely hard for any enterprise to provide 100% protection against phishing, for example. You are most likely going to have some compromises. So what it comes down to is being able to partly detect that you're compromised and do a reaction. And what PAM offers is that if you put your most important systems, be it the infrastructure that runs your IT or your financial system, which they often actually get or trying to get into, with PAM, you can at least put some speed bumps. So even if they take over your someone's importance base account, there's an ADM account or something you have to log on to a PAM system with a separate credential, which could be significantly hard to steal, not impossible. And we have seen that quite extensively when we have, by investing quite heavily into putting speed bumps between the attackers and our core systems, we have, through purple team assessments and red team assessments, seen that it does make life much, much harder for the attacker. If you look at the AI parts, of course, the whole, both the detection part and reaction parts, of course, a little bit more sensitive to put in AI in. A little bit like how the U.S. Armed Forces allows AI for defensive setups, but not for offensive setups. There has to be a human in the loop. So what's your opinion on this, Reed?
Yeah, I think actually you covered the ITDR and PAM side well in terms of what the potential impact could be. I was just thinking about, like, this is maybe more a broader comment related to kind of how I see, we've talked, a little bit about how AI might change some of the customer access patterns in terms of, like, if you have an agent that you delegate, but also the delegation risk of how do you manage that. And the other thing I'm just most curious to follow is what are the new form factors of, like, security agents that get created. And what I mean by that is, like, now that you have AI vision, which is getting cheaper and cheaper every few months, what would it be like if I could give my parents effectively an AI vision agent or AI agent with vision on all of the time to monitor the phishing attempts against them? Because I think that's been one thing I've talked to people about. And historically, over the last few years in SIAM, I've not been able to give them a good narrative or answer for what do I do if my parent gets a suspicious text that asks them to go into Bank of America and initiate a transfer. And it's like, well, to be honest, like, SIAM does not solve that. That is, like, either Bank of America has to have really good, like, fraud thresholds, or something has to happen at, like, the iOS, like Apple or Android side of how do they, mitigate and stop those types of phishing attempts. And that is just more a broad thing I'm interested in, is, like, now that you actually have AI, expertise and vision that's becoming really, really cheap, what does it mean if you start to install that in most of the phishing victims' devices as an agent to try to defend against a lot of the ways that they're trying to be duped? And obviously, attackers are going to use it from the other side. So maybe we're just always going to end up in this war of attrition. But I'll be curious to see if there's some more interesting advances there in terms of how to slow down social engineering itself as an actual threat vector.
I think that's a really interesting idea, and that's also, of course, something where the idea is not limited to your elderly parents. It could, of course, be something that you're going to see as part of the endpoint protection systems. That it keep an eye and see what's really going on, and and that of course then also offers some ability. One of the challenges that we have is that although the email, you don't really want to put your anti-phishing agents online on your emails, because that risks slowing things down too much. If it takes too much time for the AI engines to go and identify and remove the email, the risk is very high that the user meanwhile has clicked on it. So being able to distribute that type of functionality could at least mean that you can put the emails that looks a bit fishy into a quarantine for a little while, for 10 minutes, while the agent tries to figure out if it is really a fish or not.
Yep. Awesome.
So well, I think we're getting towards the end of our talk, but thank you very much for being here, and it was a very good conversation, and I hope that our co-hosts are safe in the shelters, and wish everyone a very nice evening.
Yeah, thank you both, Martin, and everyone for attending. And yeah, as you mentioned, our thoughts go out to the families of Gabriel and Orr, and hope that they're safe and hopefully a less eventful rest of the night for them. But thank you, everyone. It's been great to chat today, and reach out to either of us if you have questions, would like to continue the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.